as Preston said, I just kind of want to thank everyone for joining us tonight for this virtual program on President's Day. And I want to thank Preston for being here. And we're going to be discussing presidential visits to Ontario County, or Preston will. And I just want to let everyone know that if you do have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to direct them into the chat, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. There will be time at the end for a Q&A, and you can direct those questions in the chat, and we will open it up for a live Q&A where if you notice that there is a button for you to raise your hand, and I can call on you so that you can ask your questions directly to Preston. And I will turn this over to Preston to get started.
Well, good evening, and thank you for coming to this program, so to speak. As part of the test, I just mentioned the fact that one of the upsides, and there are very few of them last year and this year, but one of the upsides for virtual programming is that on a night like this, when we're expecting a big snow event, we don't have to go out and worry about driving in snow country, and we don't have to cancel the program and reschedule another time. So let's take a look at some presidential visits to Ontario County. Over time, 15 presidents of the United States have visited Ontario County. Some of them came here for a couple of days. Some of them came here for, well, I can't say a couple of minutes, but not a whole lot longer than that. As you'll see later on, Harry Truman rolled through Ontario County in 1948 and stopped in Geneva to give a whistle-stop speech that lasted a whole 6 minutes, and then moved on down the New York Central Railroad. That's probably the shortest visit to Ontario County by any president. But let's take a look at these overall. I think you'll agree with me, it's a fascinating story, especially as we celebrate President's Day and President's Week this year. The seal that you see in the upper right-hand picture that's projected on your screen right now dates from 1850. It was the first known rendition of a presidential seal. By the time it was approved, presidents of the United States had been visiting Ontario County for 11 years. Presidential visits have been official visits by sitting presidents. Some have been visits by presidents soon to be, like Franklin D. Roosevelt. And a few visits have been made by former presidents who came to our county as private citizens on personal business or campaigning for others. The Ontario County Historical Society has an extensive collection of presidential autographs and other memorabilia. The first president to visit Ontario County was Martin Van Buren, who visited the eastern towns of the county, including the towns of Phelps and Seneca, hoping to shore up his re-election prospects in 1839. Van Buren brought Secretary of State Joel Poinsett with him in 1839. He had just inspected the harbor improvements engineered by General Joseph G. Swift. Poinsett was formerly, or had been formerly, the U.S. ambassador to Mexico and is well known as the discoverer of the desert plant now known as the poinsettia, named for him. General Swift, now buried in Geneva's Washington Street Cemetery, was the very first graduate of the U.S. Military Academy in 1802. He made his residence in Geneva for many years after his work on the harbor at Sodas Point. President Van Buren returned in 1847 after his presidency, while he was on his way to conduct some private business and visit his friend, Land Baron James Wadsworth in Geneseo. John Quincy Adams visited Ontario County in 1843. He was actually president before Van Buren from 1825 to 1829, but he came here to the county after Van Buren, and so we've put him in that order. He was met at one of the railroad crossings on what is now Route 332 north of Canandaigua and escorted into town. From there, he proceeded down Main Street to the Congregational Church, and there he made a speech in the Congregational Church. Following that speech at the church, President Adams, John Quincy Adams, dined at the home of John Gregg, a prominent politician and businessman and land promoter on North Main Street. The mansion that was known as the Gregg Place, or the Gregg Mansion, stood on North Main where the intersection of Main Street and Scotland Road is today. It was raised in 1897 to make way for the building of Scotland Road. John Quincy Adams left Canandaigua by a new travel contrivance, the Auburn and Rochester Railroad, on July 28, 1843. Main Street at the time looked quite different then. Abraham Lincoln came to Ontario County several different times. Lincoln left Washington to speak in Massachusetts on a congressional campaign trip on September 9, 1848. He was promoting the election of Whig candidates to Congress, the present-day Republican Party not yet existing in 1848. He traveled to New York City by train, then through New England by various means. He stopped off in Albany to see Thurlow Weed, a newspaper publisher who was a strong supporter, first of the Whig Party and then of the new Republican Party. While he was there, he also called on former President Millard Fillmore on September 26th. Lincoln may have traveled through the Finger Lakes villages on the Auburn and Rochester Railroad, opened in 1840. Many sources say so. The Syracuse and Rochester direct line of the New York Central was not built yet, opening in 1853. However, Carl Sandburg, one of the most eminent historians of Lincoln's life, and a few other sources, say that Lincoln took a packet boat on the Erie Canal, crossing upstate New York in 1848. If that was the case, Lincoln passed through Ontario County, probably not stopping, but certainly waving as he went by on a slow-moving boat through the town of Port Gibson. While he was visiting Niagara Falls as part of his 1848 trip, Lincoln took extensive notes. He may have intended to use those notes in some of his future speeches. He was very impressed with the power and the mystery of the falls at Niagara. In 1861, after his election to the presidency, Lincoln took a circuitous route from his home in Springfield, Illinois, to his inauguration in Washington, D.C. He arrived in the Rochester train station at 8 o'clock in the morning on February 18th, 1861. Almost exactly the anniversary today. It was a rainy morning. The train did not stop at the designated place, and much of the crowd had to move. You can see a marker for that event near the present Rochester Amtrak station. It's a small marker affixed to a stone wall near the parking lot, and this is what it looks like. It was placed in 1912. It was part of the centennial celebration for the city of Rochester. Lincoln made a formal speech in Rochester, but it wasn't very long. I won't read the entire thing to you here, but this is Lincoln's entire speech from the back of a train at the Rochester, New York Central Station in 1861. It was well remembered by the people who were there, however, in part because the weather was so bad and the fact that it was at an early morning hour, which Lincoln acknowledged there in the first couple of sentences in his speech. The railroad car on which Lincoln rode in 1861 was new at the time. It was fitted out especially for him and was used for many years on the Auburn line through Ontario County. This is an article that was published in the Ontario County Journal on May 28, 1909, and it mentions that for many years in the late 1800s, people who perhaps weren't even thinking about Abraham Lincoln while they were traveling actually rode in the car in which Lincoln came through Ontario County. The last time that Lincoln passed through the area, he did not technically pass through the boundary lines of Ontario County, and that was aboard the funeral train that traversed upstate New York in the week after Lincoln's assassination in 1865. The route of the funeral train almost duplicated the route of the train that carried Lincoln to his inauguration in 1861. A pilot engine traveled about 10 minutes ahead of the main train, and all other trains were cleared from any line that the funeral train was following across New York and then across Ohio and Indiana and into Illinois. In its travels, the funeral train slowly passed many stations. The train crossed upstate New York at night. A ribbon of flame from mourners' torches lined the many miles of track. If you can think of bonfires and torches every few feet, stretching all the way from Albany to Buffalo, you have some idea of the spectacular scene that greeted Lincoln's funeral train and the sorrow of his constituents here in upstate New York. At these stops in the Finger Lakes area, Lincoln's funeral train paused for a few minutes or slowly passed. It followed the direct mainline route from Syracuse to Rochester and consequently did not enter Ontario County, but in passing from Newark to Palmyra to Macedon and then on to Fairport, it came very close to the boundary line, the northern boundary line of Ontario County. Funeral sermons were written by local members of the clergy and preached locally. The funeral sermon for this area, for Lincoln, incidentally, was written by the pastor of the Congregational Church here in Canandaigua, and it was delivered at the church about the time the funeral train passed by. Andrew Johnson was the next president to visit Ontario County. Johnson's visit to Canandaigua in 1866 was really quite controversial. He had with him General and future President Ulysses Grant and several other military and political dignitaries, and was promoting his policy on Reconstruction. That was not popular locally, where Lincoln's Republicans were very popular. Andrew Johnson, if you recall, was the vice president that took over the presidency after Lincoln's assassination. And Johnson was from Tennessee. He had been loyal to the Union during the war, but he had many Southern attitudes. Johnson had made many controversial vetoes, and several in particular that are detailed on your screen here. The first Civil Rights Bill passed by Congress, the extension of the work of the Freedmen's Bureau. Congress overrode many of those vetoes, but Johnson was campaigning for his views on Reconstruction, which he thought were more constitutional than what was being promoted by Congress at the time. It was a midterm election, and Johnson was defending his view that the 14th Amendment, just being proposed and out for voters' approval, was unconstitutional. And he was also arguing in favor of some of the things that he wanted to do that were more conservative than what Congress wanted to do at the time. It did him no good. Very shortly after his appearance here and in many other places in his circuit through Ontario County, the House of Representatives impeached Andrew Johnson. He was the first president to be impeached. And shortly after that, the Senate failed to convict him of impeachment by a single vote. Millard Fillmore was president from 1850 to 1853. However, he visited Ontario County for the first time on August 16, 1871. He had been away from the presidency for almost 20 years. He spent several days enjoying the Clifton Springs water cure. The picture that you see there on the left is the original water cure building that was removed to build what folks in Clifton Springs refer to now as the SAN, or the Clifton Springs Sanitarium, that was built in the 1890s. Nearly 2 years later, on June 17th and 18th, 1873, Fillmore came back to Canandaigua to sit in the courtroom during the trial of Susan B. Anthony. He had been at Clifton Springs once again, heard about the Anthony trial, and returned here. Chester Arthur was one of the presidents who did not spend a great deal of time in Ontario County. He came to Geneva in 1884, specifically to attend the funeral of his Secretary of the Treasury, prominent Geneva resident Charles Folger. Likewise, Benjamin Harrison, president from 1889 to 1893, traveled to Canandaigua by rail on his way to Rochester to dedicate a Civil War monument. His rail route into Canandaigua is today the route of Ontario Pathways. So many of you may have walked that route for some distance between Canandaigua and Stanley, for example. And if you did, that's the route that was traveled by Benjamin Harrison and by several other presidents. President Harrison was one of the first dignitaries to use the newly opened Canandaigua Railroad Station that opened in 1890. He got a fairly extensive amount of publicity, even though he spent very little time here. In Rochester, Benjamin Harrison attended and participated in the dedication of the new Civil War monument erected on Washington Square. That monument is the next block up from what is now Geva Theater. So any of you that have been to Geva Theater, if you come out the front door and look straight up the street about a block, it's very hard to miss Rochester's Civil War monument up there. In 1898, future President Theodore Roosevelt came to Canandaigua, Clifton Springs, Phelps, and Geneva while he was campaigning for governor. He was just back from the fighting in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. And actually, he had with him one of his famous Rough Riders who blew the charge on a bugle just before each of his speeches. Theodore Roosevelt's speech in 1898 and Andrew Johnson's speech in 1868 were made from a platform erected on the park in front of the old Canandaigua Hotel. Today, the Canandaigua police station stands where that old hotel stood prior to the fire that destroyed it in 1971. TR, as he was better known politically, returned in 1910 after his presidency, while he was campaigning for Republicans during the midterm elections that year. The local barrel hose company paraded the former president to the Davidson Opera House on South Main Street, where he gave a speech defending progressive ideas that he supported. William Howard Taft, who succeeded TR, arrived in Canandaigua 2 years earlier in 1908. He also gave a campaign speech at the Davidson Opera House. On August 23rd, 1911, Taft again arrived in Canandaigua, coming by rail from Washington, D.C. He stopped here only briefly while his private car was interchanged from the Pennsylvania to the New York Central Railroad for the remaining trip into Rochester. There you can see the Canandaigua Railroad Yard on your left, and the area where the passenger cars awaited being interchanged and moving out of Canandaigua. Today, the area where those passenger cars are is a city parking lot for the city of Canandaigua. Taft was going to attend the National Convention of the Grand Army of the Republic in Rochester, the Union Civil War Veterans Organization. He got a lot of press coverage, however, for his very few impromptu remarks in Canandaigua. He was, according to the papers, working on his Rochester speech, but there were so many calls there at the railroad station and outside the car for him to appear and make a few comments that he finally came out and pleased the crowd by making a few remarks about his presidency and what he intended to do in Rochester. An unfortunate event marred Taft's trip to Rochester. After the convention that he attended, a Lehigh Valley passenger train derailed on a bridge in the village of Manchester, killing several of the veterans and knocking several of the railroad cars off the bridge into Canandaigua Outlet. If you walk the outlet trail in Manchester, a very pleasant walk in nicer weather, you can see the very site where this tragic wreck took place. Right beneath that bridge, there is a marker that was placed there by the Red Jacket Rotary Club, marking the place where that 1911 wreck took place. Franklin D. Roosevelt arrived in Canandaigua by automobile while he was governor in 1930. He was on an inspection tour of several sites in the Finger Lakes where New York State had some construction projects in progress. While he was here, FDR was photographed by Canandaigua photographer Peggy Stewart and was entertained at lunch by the Canandaigua Rotary Club and the Exchange Club. The Canandaigua Exchange Club eventually became what is now the Kiwanis Club in Canandaigua. Harry Truman came through Ontario County by train in 1948. I know it's difficult for you to read that list of stops there on the left, but that's there just to show you the extensive list of whistle stops in the area that Truman's campaign train made at the time. He was conducting these whistle stops campaigns during the presidential election that took place later in 1948 and passed through Canandaigua, Shortsville, Clifton Springs, and Phelps. His train stopped just long enough for a quick speech, actually about 6 minutes from the end of his train in Geneva. And there you can see a picture of him taken in Geneva during the time of his 6-minute speech. I'm not sure that I can do this, but I'm going to try to play you the speech, recording of the speech that has been digitized and made available by the Truman Presidential Library in Missouri.
Propaganda.
You know, Preston, it's a little hard to hear. Yeah, Preston, we're having a hard time hearing it.
Okay. Well, we'll move on because I've been told that it's very difficult to listen to, and it is even from where I am. As you could tell, if you could hear any of it, it was certainly a sharply partisan speech. That's why he stopped in Geneva. He thought that the audience there would be a little more friendly than he might find in other parts of the county. And you may know from the election of 1848 that Truman was an underdog, that right up until election day, many Americans, perhaps most, assumed that his Republican challenger, Governor Thomas E. Dewey of New York, would become the president. And it was far into the night before people realized that Harry Truman actually had won the presidency in his own right in 1948. Well, on March 14th, 2006, President George W. Bush came to Canandaigua as part of a series of visits to various parts of the country where he was gathering information and promoting senior citizen registration for Medicare Part D. Originally scheduled for the Mohawk Valley, the Bush visit here was changed to the Rochester area late in the scheduling process. Canandaigua was chosen because it fit the criterion for transportation in proximity to Rochester Airport. It was also important that Canandaigua offered two sizable meeting venues that could be linked by a short motorcade, Canandaigua Academy and Ferris Hils. At Ferris Hils, in particular, the president himself met with residents and promoted Medicare Part D registration. President Bush met with many residents and staff at Ferris Hils and members of the public and local government officials at the academy. Linda Hawks, then the CEO of Thompson Health, accompanied President Bush during her visit his visit rather, to Ferris Hils. And you can see her standing at the right in this picture. She remembers the president as very gracious, a true Southern gentleman, as she actually told me earlier today, who spent time interacting with residents and asked about her son, a naval aviator, recently returned from deployment in the Persian Gulf at that time. Well, 15 presidents have visited Ontario County, some just passing through, some coming here for the specific purposes of making a speech, some campaigning for themselves, some campaigning for others. I'm glad that we were able to get through this, and at this point, I'll be happy to entertain any questions that anyone might have.
Let's see, it looks like so if you looks like Deborah says she wanted to know if Bill Clinton visited Hobart College.
You know, I think he did, and that may be a fault in my program. Now that his name is mentioned in connection with Hobart, I believe that he did, so that would make 16. The man who was longtime president of Hobart at the time of Clinton's presidency was a person who knew the Clintons personally, and I think you're right. I think the Clintons did visit Hobart.
And then Steve says that he noticed that Bess Truman was in one of the pictures with her husband and wanted to know if any other first ladies had come to Ontario County.
Not that I'm aware of, at least none of the sources that I was able to find in putting this together.
And Maria thought it was interesting that a few modern presidents had visited Canandaigua.
Well, it depends on the term modern, how you define that. Certainly, George W. Bush's visit to Canandaigua was the most extensive visit by a modern president. Prior to that, Harry Truman rolled through, and as you saw from some of those others from the early 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt gave 2 speeches here. William Howard Taft gave a speech here. I don't know whether you'd call them modern presidents or not. That's a century ago now. So, if you include them, that was perhaps an extensive visit, but I don't think either of them gave a speech or made a presentation that involved as many people as George W. Bush spoke to while he was here in 2006.
And to add to that comment, Faye Marie said that it was an interesting presentation and that she was fortunate enough to have seen George W. Bush when he visited in 2006. To go back to Deborah's comment about Bill Clinton, it looks like he gave the commencement speech 2 years ago, and Jay was said that the president of Hobart was in the Peace Corps, was a Peace Corps director in Clinton's administration.
Right, he was part of the Clinton administration, right.
And that they found a link, and it also included that about President Clinton from the Hobart William Smith commencement speaker that he was a commencement speaker in 2017, and they included that in the chat.
I appreciate that being brought to my attention because that certainly is something that's missing from the presentation, and be glad to put that in for the next one.
And that was Myron Clark considered to be Lincoln's vice president?
Not seriously. His first vice president was Hannibal Hamlin. The choices for his vice president, the choices for several of his important cabinet members were, as one historian put it a few years ago, an attempt to put together a team of rivals to get people to serve the cause of the Union and President Lincoln, who had been his rivals for the nomination for the presidency. And Myron Clark had achieved the role of governor of the state of New York, but it was one term, and he was actually a prohibition governor, which was not a really popular stand to take in many parts of New York. So, you know, in terms of upstate New Yorkers that took active roles in the Lincoln presidency, William Henry Seward was far and away the most important upstater to be considered for any role in the Lincoln White House. And Hannibal Hamlin, who was relatively unknown at the time, and incidentally is the namesake for the town of Hamlin in Monroe County, was the man who was chosen and then dropped when Lincoln ran for re-election as president. Again, it was a somewhat political decision in 1864 that Andrew Johnson was selected. Johnson was a former Democrat. He was a loyal Democrat during the war. He was from Tennessee, a Southerner. He harbored, as we later learned, a number of attitudes that ran contrary to what the majority in Congress and the Lincoln administration wanted to carry out. And when Lincoln was assassinated and Johnson found himself president, he was a president who was promoting some ideas that were largely pro-Southern, even though he had supported the Union, and that made him extremely unpopular.
It looks like we have a few other comments. It looks like Maria said some of us protested Bush's visit in 2006. Were there any other protests during the presidential visits?
I'm sure, and none of them for the previous presidents got a great deal of publicity. I'm sure that there were some people who opposed the appearance of some of the presidents. You know, John Quincy Adams had been denied re-election as president, so he was a one-termer. Martin Van Buren was a one-term president, having been the man who unfortunately presided over one of our earlier periods of economic depression in 1837. You know, Benjamin Harrison was a one-term president. It was a time when there was a lot of opposition, especially in the mid-1800s, by people who lived around here. But it was also a time when placard-carrying protesters were not very common. If you look at newspaper coverage, modern Americans today would probably be appalled at what was considered very common news coverage from all sides, all political points of view at the time. Newspapers very proudly proclaimed their political background and their political points of view, and it was well known in the 1800s which political parties each of the newspapers supported. The concept that the media should somehow be composed of reporters who were impartial was not an idea that had really caught on in America until the 20th century.
And then it looks like going back to the comments regarding First Ladies visiting Ontario County. Jay mentions that Second Lady, Lady Lynn Cheney, visited Canandaigua in 2002 to 2003 timeframe and spoke at the Historical Society.
Right, when the Historical Society had a dinner here in Canandaigua to celebrate their 100th anniversary, she was the featured speaker.
Yep, I guess it was at the invitation of Leah Berman, her then chief of staff, and at the part-time resident with second home on North Pearl Street.
Correct.
And then, kind of split up in the comments, hold on. And then there was Steve who said, how about those who ran for president, the also rans? He wanted to know, he said he recalls that Gary Hart visited Manchester in 1984, and Tom Dewey in his capacity as governor, and that he participated in the groundbreaking ceremony for the thruway near Fisher, and that Dewey ran in 1944 and again in 1948 and lost both times.
I don't personally recall Gary Hart's visit, although to me, 1984 is not that long ago. But Governor Dewey had been governor of New York during World War II and for several terms. He was the grand old man of the grand old party in the late 1940s, which is why today the thruway is officially the Governor Thomas C. Dewey Thruway. Dewey made a speech near the Victor interchange, which is right along Route 96 near the village of Fishers. He also was part of a motorcade that ran the length of the thruway down through Manchester and eastward. The thruway was opened and dedicated in sections as it was completed, much in the same way that the original Erie Canal was. And Dewey was present at several of those. I don't know that he gave any major speeches in Manchester or elsewhere, but he certainly came here a number of different times in the years that he was governor.
And Deborah wanted to say thank you and that she found this to be very interesting.
Well, thank you. You know, thinking about the First Ladies, I do recall that in the 1990s, I don't have the date on my fingertips right now, but Hillary Clinton was here by herself and talked to some people and gave a speech on the steps of the courthouse. So in the early 1990s, Hillary Clinton was here.
And Steve said, how about vice president?
I can't give you a definitive answer on that. Of course, Theodore Roosevelt was vice president before he became president, not very long, but he originally was elected vice president to William McKinley, and then William McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo in September of 1901, and that's what propelled Theodore Roosevelt into the presidency. There's one right there. And of course, Andrew Johnson was the second vice president for Abraham Lincoln. There's another, trying to think very quickly. Well, Harry Truman had been vice president for Franklin Roosevelt, so there's yet another. And let's see if I can think quickly about any more, but several vice presidents going back.
It looks like
Pardon me?
Steve and Eric says Nelson Rockefeller.
Certainly Nelson Rockefeller had come to Ontario County for several different reasons. He had served, he'd been governor of the state for, I want to say 16 years. I'm not sure it was that long, but he was in and out of Ontario County a good many times. And of course, he was later vice president for Gerald Ford.
Steve says from 59 to 73, looks like 14 years. And then VP under Gerald Ford from 74 to 77.
Right.
And I just want to let people know that if they do want to ask some questions verbally, they're more than welcome to. If they want to continue to put them in the chat, they can do that.
And I would encourage anyone who's got some additional information that they'd like to let me know about, certainly to send me an email. The easiest email address for me is my email address at Finger Lakes Community College. It is preston.pierce@flcc.edu. As frequently happens, I learned some things myself tonight and got some new insights that I certainly would want to incorporate into a future presentation. And so I thank you all for that. Thank you for coming, and really would encourage anyone to send me any other suggestions or information they might have.
Steve says that you definitely make history come to life. Great job.
Well, a shout out to Steve. I know him personally. I know he's got a long time history, or a long time interest in political history and involvement in politics. And thank you, Steve.
And it looks like we had one more question come in really quick. It looks like Eric wanted to know if you had any examples of some of the presidential artifacts that may be available at the Historical Society.
They have quite a few. In fact, I'm not sure when it started, but the Ontario County Historical Society has an autograph collection. And in that collection, I believe I'm safe in saying they have an autograph on something of every president from George Washington forward. So they've got a complete collection of them there. A few years ago, they had an exhibit there on all things presidential, kind of leading up to the last presidential election. And so they have a lot of campaign buttons and literature. They've got a large banner for the 1860 election with Abraham Lincoln that promotes not only Lincoln, but Hannibal Hamlin that I mentioned earlier. So the Ontario County Historical Society does have an extensive collection of presidential artifacts. Probably their most precious artifact is the life mask of Abraham Lincoln. I won't go into detail about how life masks were made, except to say that it involved a living person having to sit still while wet plaster was applied to their face and allowed to dry before the mold that it produced was removed from their face, so that castings could be made. And there is a life mask of Lincoln about the time that he was elected in 1860 that is among the artifacts in the collection of the Historical Society.
Wow, I would have never known that was there. It looks like you have several thank yous in the chat, and that they felt that this was very informative this evening. And that was from Natalie.
Well, thank you all again. It was a pleasure to be here. And again, any of you that want to contact me, I'd love to get any additional information. If someone has a snapshot or a picture of Bill Clinton's presence at Hobart College, I'd love to have that, to include that information in the program. and love to hear from any and all of you.
And then I will include your email address in the chat again, just so that people have it if they wanted to send you anything. Again, thanks again, Preston, and thank everyone for attending tonight. And I'm not sure if there are any more questions that anyone has before we go. It looks like I don't see any more. So again, thank you guys for tuning in to this program, and thank you, Preston. It was informative and great as always. So I really appreciate you doing this tonight.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here, and I hope everybody escapes the snow tonight.